There's a bunch of baggage tied with it where if you say open world, people start thinking about big open world sandboxes. And I think that what we're seeing in games is there's many, many shades of exploration, and you can take elements from those big open world games. You can take new elements, you can make the experience that feels right for your game.
Hey, welcome back to Game Brain. My name's Don. It seems like over the last few years, more traditionally single-player linear series are starting to take more risks with implementing more open-world elements into their design, but without falling into the traps, I guess, that most people associate with big open worlds. Think Metro Exodus, the latest God of War, and surprisingly 2019's Gears of War 5, or Gears 5, as it wants you to call it. So I was really interested in finding out how the designers of Gears 5 over at developer The Coalition came to revitalize the franchise with the addition of expanded environments, more vehicle-based exploration, and even adding in tactical combat abilities as well. There's a lot of new things in Gears 5, and I guess I just wanted to ask the designers how it all came together behind the scenes. For this mini documentary, I spoke with the Coalition's campaign design director Matt Searcy and lead overworlds designer Nick Letizia. As you can tell by the runtime, this is a pretty long video, so you can find some time codes in the description if you want to skip forward to the topics that you find interesting. So Matt Searcy was also the campaign design director on Gears of War 4, so naturally I started our discussion by asking how building a foundation with the series on Gears of War 4 helped prepare the Coalition to try some new things on Gears 5.
Gears 4, we actually always talked about this strategy of like walk before we run. So when we started Gears 4, there was actually a huge effort before we even started talking about what the game would be, just to make sure we fully understood the way that Gears worked. We had to port Gears into Unreal 4, which we'd had a lot of experience working in. And so the first bit of the project was about picking Gears 3 as our starting base. And we actually made sure we were like pixel perfect. We developed a bunch of tech and debug tools to make sure we were starting from what we felt was the best Gears base. But after that, we did a whole bunch of stuff, like we did Gears 101, where we remixed and rebuilt old Gears levels. We worked on developing sort of a language for talking about enemies and the way that the Gears sort of combat ecosystem works in terms of flanking routes and waves of enemies and guns. And all of that basically came together inside Gears of War 4, which was our attempt to make a great Gears campaign, which built the foundation that we were able to build Gears 5 off of. So we had a goal for the game as a whole to challenge expectations about what a Gears game could be, and specifically around adding as much player choice as we could into the Gears experience. Gears 4 happened, basically in one day. There's only so much we could do with the squad. And so we wanted this feeling of a much more epic story. We wanted it to feel sort of like Gears games you'd played before, but with brand new experiences and this feeling of discovery and this feeling of going on a journey. And we wanted to, tear the squad apart and put them back together and have the gameplay match that story arc that we were putting into the game.
So, these comm towers, where do we find them?
We'll need higher ground. I say we make our way east.
And so then how early into development was it decided the campaign would be built around two semi-open world environments?
We knew pretty early, so in pre-pro for sure. We started mapping out the story, and we knew that the middle two acts were going to be about taking the squad on a journey even before we knew about doing open environments and exploration. And at the same time, we were prototyping what we call palette cleansers, which are, in the past, they've been truck rides and the motorbike rides and crazy events, basically, that give you a break from the core Gears gameplay. And one of the palette cleansers was around a Skiff-based vehicle. And very early in that prototype, Rod, actually, who's the studio head, he was playing it and he said, I just want to go that way. So we very early started breaking okay, this vehicle feels great if you can drive it in any direction. And those two things sort of converged, the need for a journey in the story and this vehicle that was the inspiration for how we were going to travel around the overworlds. Those are the two things that led it off in super early in pre-pro.
It's a huge decision to take what has traditionally been a linear game into more open environments. And were there any other games that you were inspired by or referenced when you were trying to conceptualize how the open world was actually going to work?
To be honest, not at the beginning, because we didn't go into it going, you know what Gears needs is like, we need this open world thing added to Gears. There was never a conversation that was, hey, let's put open world elements in Gears. It was more evolutionary. It was, we had this vehicle, we knew we wanted these breaks in the gameplay, we wanted more exploration. We were trying to find what felt right for us. Later in development, like midway through production, we started to see, God of War came out around that time. It was really interesting to see how they had handled open world elements without making what people traditionally thought of as an open world. And even at that time, we were also reflecting on Tomb Raider, and at one point we got to speak to a couple of the guys who'd worked on that when Microsoft opened up the Initiative studio. So we definitely took inspiration from those games as we went, but at the beginning it was really about us trying to find what felt right for Gears.
And can you tell me about the playtesting side of things? I understand playtesting from an early stage of development was pretty important. Tell me about the horizontal slices the team developed.
We usually do sort of an exit pre-pro demo, which we did, which is more of a proof of concept where we sort of tied all those elements together. But twice during production, we did what we called Genesis, which was like, a made-up word for a date where we would pull all the systems together. So we sort of, the lead producers and I, we kind of stuck a point in the schedule where we thought, Jack was going to be at a certain place, our new enemies were going to be at a certain place. We'd have sort of placeholder narrative beats or dialogue. The levels would all be at a certain place and the overworlds would be there. And it was a huge team effort, like multiple weeks to essentially like stitch up the patient is what we call it. Because, a lot of games don't do that midway or a third of the way into production, which is the first time we did it. Because it's just a huge effort. But what we were able to do was we tested it at many, many different levels. So we had the entire studio. We took 3 days out of the schedule and everybody played it. We had open surveys. We had follow-up meetings where we did sort of like what's working, what's not working with different groups. We were able to see where the story was holding up and where it was falling down. And we made big decisions, like we made cuts, we cut levels, we redirected effort into things like the overworld and into other areas. And it worked so well that even though it's a huge amount of work, we did it one more time. I think it was like maybe 2/3 of the way through production. And both times it was like, it's difficult. The game's not done. It's not always fun. So you're sort of projecting where it's going to get to. Parts of it are fun and parts aren't. But the team did an amazing job of sort of like being honest with ourselves and with each other about what we thought was going to work and what wasn't, and where to double down and where to, make smart cuts.
And that first horizontal slice that you talked about as well, and some of the feedback and people not mincing words about what wasn't working at that early stage, a third into development, like you said, what were some of the big points of feedback about where the overworlds were at that point?
They weren't fun. like people could see the promise, especially of the Skiff, but I think in that first horizontal slice we didn't have like Jack's ultimate abilities, for instance.
Well, even we were just still trying to figure out Jack's abilities at that point too. So that
Yeah, we had some. Well, Jack, we had some abilities for him that we locked in really early, maybe about half of them, and then about half of them were in flux. We sort of had strategies for what they were going to be. But specifically to the overworld, I think we got a lot of feedback around navigation. So, I think we've reshaped the overworlds completely after, for sure, that first Genesis. I think the second one we reshaped it, but we reshaped it along the lines of what we had. Like, we kind of came back. I think that's when Jamie, our art director, sort of took the layout we had and scrubbed back over it with like a new sort of pass, but kept the layout. So a lot of it was navigation feedback about sort of the flow and the easiness of it.
And Nick, you're made the lead overworld designer as well, which I understand is sort of a new role for the team, considering it's the first time open worlds have been a part of the franchise. At what stage is that role sort of created and you sort of receive it?
I think eventually as the game evolved and we realized making maps traditionally, how we tried to traditionally make them, actually wasn't working out for an open world. And I think throughout that first kind of half of the project, working so closely with that team, I started to kind of come up with some ideas. And then eventually I think I basically just pitched some things to Matt about what I would like to do with the overworlds. And that's when we made the change.
Nick, you're saying through your own sort of input and interest in that part of the game, it sort of naturally put you into that role. I mean, what were some of the suggestions you were bringing to Matt and the team about how the worlds should work, could work? What were those discussions?
Well, there's naturally, and then there was me hounding Matt for about 6 months.
That wasn't that long.
But I think one thing that I actually remember quite distinctly was I'd gone to GDC that year. I'm trying to remember which year exactly. I think it was 2017. GDC for me was always like a chance to kind of see all these new things and get all this inspiration and kind of I always like to say recharge my game design batteries. I had just seen a lot of stuff that year, and I think one thing in particular, Nintendo had given a talk about the new Breath of the Wild, the new Zelda game. And they had gone through some of that stuff. And I remember just being so inspired by that. And I came back, and that's when I kind of put together like my real kind of solid pitch for how to kind of take the overworlds in a new place. And
it was only 130 pages, right?
It was a long presentation, yeah. But I think what I had done is I'd kind of gone through each aspect of the overworlds. You know, the traveling, the different locations, which we called POIs, kind of amongst the team, and how we would kind of treat each of those locations and how we would explore. And one that was important to me was looking at what we do traditionally with Gears combat. And throughout the game, you get a lot of you get the traditional taking cover, you've got your group of enemies, you have your fronts. And one thing I challenged the design team on the overworlds was to make all of our combat experiences feel different than what you might get in the campaign. The reason for that was we knew that these were optional missions, most of them, and so that we wanted to give people that explored a little bit, we wanted to give them an experience that felt a little bit different than what they were getting in the main campaign. Bigger, badder, and different, I think, from maybe what they were getting on the main path.
And for you, Nick, as well, I mean, were there any major design tropes that you usually see in open worlds that you wanted to avoid? I mean, was there anything that you didn't want to do that you'd seen in other games with big environments?
You know, some of the simple things, like I just wanted to avoid turning it into a collectathon. So we didn't want fetch quests or fast travel or just things like that where you're just kind of grinding through stuff. We wanted everything to feel like it was part of a journey and you were traveling there. And if you didn't want to go there, you didn't have to, and you could just kind of go to the next place. So it was important to us to make it feel as much of a Gears game as we could without constricting it too much.
So you're saying there wasn't any fetch quests where you go and fetch Marcus like 3 bandanas across the world or something?
Yeah, we definitely tried to make sure, like Nick said, like we didn't want fast travel. It wasn't about being an open world game for us. Like that's not what it was. It was about going on a journey, and that's why so much of it was driven from the feeling of riding that skiff out into the desert or out into the moments. And, you know, we made people drive from place to place, and I think that we gave them a fun thing to do on the way, which was drive the skiff or look into different POIs. But we didn't want to fall into a bunch of open world tropes because honestly we weren't making an open world game. We were trying to make a great Gears game that had exploration elements in it.
How do you think about that term open world then? I mean, would you push it away in regards to Gears 5?
Yeah, we did actually.
Yeah, we didn't use it.
We didn't use it internally. That's why we called them overworlds. We had to make up a name for it. But it was something we talked about internally. It was something we talked about when we were doing our launch coverage and stuff. We just tried to stay away from that. There's a bunch of baggage tied with it where if you say open world, people start thinking about big open world sandboxes, and I think that what we're seeing in games is there's many, many shades of exploration, and you can take elements from those big open world games, you can take new elements, you can make the experience that feels right for your game. So we focused on exploration and the feeling of exploration and about giving you player choice in those spaces. But for us, it was never about, we never had a let's add open world to Gears as a directive. That wasn't the path that we went down.
Look away.
You lied to me. And then, after you got hurt, you pushed us away. Like we didn't even know you.
We were talking about sort of a lot of those side objectives in the overworlds, and I mean narrative is one of the main benefits of having a bit more space and the dialogue between crews. I mean, for both of you, when the overworlds are starting to take shape, how are you talking with the writers to sort of integrate the narrative into the way the exploration is sort of allowing more time for character development?
That was an interesting journey because Gears has traditionally been very linear, you know, and then you have cinematics that play out and drive key story points along. There's definitely a learning curve for us around creating a non-linear story, but it's also something that solidifies a little bit later than the other things in the game because it takes a while for the overworld to take shape and all the different elements. So what we ended up doing was we worked sort of backwards from the story points we knew we needed to support. So if you think about the ice overworld in Act 2, you know, it kicks off with the events in Riftworm, which is a massive story beat where Kate loses her uncle and she sort of has her first a really in-depth experience with the Swarm, going into sort of like this nightmare sequence where she's controlling them, and it ends with arriving at the secret laboratory in Mount Kadar. And we knew the player was going to do certain things in certain orders and other things in random orders. So we would layer narrative in many, many levels. We would have the main storyline beats that Nick and I and the writers would work with. We would know they would happen in a certain order, whether it was going to New Hope as your first objective. Then we had the storyline beats that were non-linear. And so, Kate experiences all these crazy nightmares. And we made sure they could play out in any order, and they would always feel like things were getting worse. And we would have a little bit of dynamic dialogue that would look at which ones happened in which order. And so we hit narrative on all those different levels, and it was designed so that, depending on how you wanted to engage in the story, you could engage at any one of those levels, whether you're going super deep or you were just cruising along the main path and catching the main plot points.
So are Paddocks Nomads up to the task of hauling back the rest of those beacons? Yeah, I was wondering the same thing.
And I understand as well that the Skiff at some point had combat as well.
Yes, it did.
Can you tell me the story of why that didn't make it into the final game?
I mean, there's a short story and a long story.
Far away.
Even though we made fun combat for the Skiff, it actually detracted from the experience that we wanted the player to have in the overworld. At the end of the day, it was a difficult decision because it was like, oh, we're a Gears game. We should have guns on everything. We should be shooting enemies all the time. I'm sure you can see like some remnants of it, right? The second player's seat was originally a turret, and then we sort of turned into a navigation station. But ultimately, it gave us time to talk and experience the characters and the story. And Nick was the one who was like, worked tirelessly to make a great combat experience. And then we went, you know what? This is fun. Let's not keep it.
Well, I think, like, just to kind of build on what you said, it was something that we realized kind of into the project, that each of the missions was very combat focused, and each of the POIs was very combat focused, and oftentimes very intensely combat focused. You might be fighting a boss or multiple bosses or kind of, very bombastic kind of stuff. And so I think we realized that actually getting on the Skiff and riding between each location actually felt kind of nice. Like, it was a nice break and gave you a breather, and it gave the player the opportunity to kind of plan where they wanted to go next. We had a lot of great writing that kind of gave them the interesting conversations where they just talked about what just happened, and they talked about where they're going and what they're going to do. And those moments just all felt really nice to us. And I think our goal was to try and make it so that you could get to any location within like less than a minute. It was definitely the challenge, and I think we definitely achieved that. So we realized that being on the Skiff for less than a minute and just kind of taking that break was really valuable and important for the pacing of the game. And I think that was probably one of the biggest factors in deciding to not have the combat out there.
Okay, let's go.
Marcus, we got a location. If there was a lab in Mount Kadar, we'll know soon enough.
Can you tell me about your philosophy for pacing the campaign of Gears 5, especially when you're balancing the linear and the open world elements?
So when we looked at pacing the Gears 4 campaign, it was really like balls to the wall, like, okay, we're going to have a few big story beats, and outside of those, it's going to go, 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 go. And when we look back on it, we were really proud of sort of like hitting that Gears feeling, but we felt like we could do a lot more if we gave ourselves more interesting in-between beats. So when we set out to make the Gears 5 campaign, I was sort of looking at the structure with the writer and with Rod and talking about how in each act we were gonna manage to bring in those beats, those like reflection areas. And we very early on mapped it out in terms of the first act is going to be about best-in-class Gears of War. So it's going to be missions with encounters that have great hooks, and as we're going to drive you through this feeling of the war coming back to Sarah. But even in that, we looked for those places of more interesting story delivery, so more story-based environment. And then the idea that I had was always to hit the second act and have the game kind of open up in terms of pacing. So we would have these core missions that you could go and dive into for 30, 40 minutes at a time. And then when you came out of those core missions, it would be like coming back out. It even worked out this way because a lot of them are inside. You kind of come back outside. It's like that breath of fresh air. And you kind of reset yourself and decide what you're going to do next. And the goal was to give you those Gears pacing moments and then give you something totally new to dive into in between them.
Just to touch on that as well, something that we do as a studio, which I think is really important for this sort of thing, for pacing especially, is we'll keep a basically track throughout the whole process which enemies are being used where, what weapons are being used, what the intensity of combat is being. And so as we play through, as we're constantly iterating, we'll reference that, and we'll look for blips in the radar or moments where we're like, you know what, it's been kind of a high intense action for a long time. Let's kind of tone it down in this next section and stuff. So as a team, we would often rev on that stuff a lot and kind of iron out that pacing throughout the process. So that was really valuable to kind of track that and maintain that. That helped us a lot.
Does that process become much harder when you're talking about semi-open world environments?
Well, in terms of giving the player choice, yeah. I mean, we had to kind of ensure that the side content was side content. We had to make sure that, it was kind of outside the main pacing of the game. And we didn't look necessarily at each POI mission as vital to the main story in our pacing, but I definitely felt like we knew that within those different POIs, each of them was kind of grouped together. Sometimes they're always in groups of 3. We would pace them within those 3. We knew if we had done something in the first mission, we'd maybe want to amp it up for the second, or build off of that in the next mission. So it was a bit of an interesting process there, where we kind of had almost two gameplay loops we had to concern ourselves with.
Yeah, and I think what Nick did, where he really pushed on the secondary missions to be really, really different and have very strong hooks, was one of the ways that we tackled that problem. So when we look at the encounters, I think one of the things that makes Gears feel the way it does, and I really enjoy about the game and working on the game, is each encounter is more like a puzzle, right? Like when you ramp up the difficulty in Gears, the game gets even more interesting sometimes, because you have to look for more strategies. And Jack really played into that. So when we look at the hooks for all the main mission encounters, we're trying to be very intentional about sort of what puzzles we're asking you to solve. And then what Nick found with the design team was working on those POIs was you push that encounter hook like to the limit. And I think by doing that, and by making them optional so you can walk away from them, we were able to sort of go like, hey, we know you're going to have these 30-40 minute crafted paced experiences inside these missions, and then you're going to get these like interesting experiences in the overworld where you get a downbeat that lasts as long as you want it to last, and then you get this really like intense and identifiable, like memorable encounter, but it's going to be 5 minutes, right? And then it's up to you if you're going to put those back to back to back to back, or if you're going to take a breath because you found it so intense, or you're going to go dive into the next story mission. So we loosened up, I guess, on trying to control the pacing in those overworld sections, and instead just focused on making them like really memorable, like little peaks in our pacing, in our combat pacing.
That was kind of the fun of designing those spaces as well, because it did give us some creative freedom.
We got a lot of, we can't do that, and then we're like, well, have we tried doing that? So
what if we fight a carrier in a train tunnel in the dark? So I think it gave us, creative freedom to do stuff that maybe wouldn't make total sense in a linear mission, but I think we got to have some fun with that stuff, and that was really valuable for us, because I think that helped us push those things and make them feel unique.
One of the best things was when we would make a really hard overworld secondary mission space, realizing that different players would play it completely differently based off their own personal style and what they've done with Jack, but they'd also play it completely differently depending on what other things they'd done in the overworld first. So a great example of that is one of the ice overworld secondary missions is like, we ended up making it super foggy. That was one of those things where Nick and the level designer were like, what if we crank the fog all the way to the top so you can't see across this bowl? And it became like a totally different puzzle. It had a warden in there that was a really hard part of it. It was one of the ones we started with our player-initiated combat, so a little bit of stealth. And it played completely differently if you had gone to one of the missions where you get the cloak ability for Jack, and watching how people would tackle that without cloak versus with cloak. Like, that was when the game started to feel like it was coming alive to me, because the overworlds and the Jack and the secondary missions, like the intensity of some of those secondary missions, they were all starting to layer on top of each other the way that we had hoped the new gameplay loop would.
You were both mentioning the new abilities for Jack that were starting to take form as the design started to coalesce, but obviously Jack's experience points and obviously those sort of ultimate abilities as well were such a massive part of exploration, more or less the main reason to be going into these side areas. I mean, was it always clear that Jack's abilities and gaining new experience points for them was going to be like the linchpin of exploration?
No. I mean, it became very clear pretty early, but I had to be honest. Early on, like, we thought exploration would be the reason for exploration. Maybe naively, we thought, we'll dump you in this overworld and won't tell you where the next main mission is, and you'll go around looking for interesting things to do. And you know what? That appeals to a lot of people, but it doesn't appeal to everybody. And we knew you would get stuff for Jack by exploring the overworlds, but the ultimate abilities, I think, when they became the linchpin was probably a little bit later on. Actually, it probably had to do with Nick when you came on.
Yeah, I think the Uber abilities definitely came later. I think it was when we realized, exactly. We were putting people into these multiple setting missions, and we thought at the end they needed something to feel like it was worth the effort. And I think marrying those two, Jack and the overworlds, felt really natural. You're finding tech, you're exploring, you fight, you explore, you upgrade, you loop, you repeat. And so it gave us a really good hook at the end for people to want to see these missions to the end, because they knew they'd be actually getting like a really fun, really exciting ability to use that would change the gameplay, and it did.
Yeah, something Nick talks about sometimes is like players managing their own difficulty. So in Gears we have 4 different difficulty levels on campaign, and the hardest one is really hard. But this is the first time in a Gears game we've given you tools to manage the difficulty within those settings, right? So if you were a purist and you want to get by on your skill, you skip all those side missions. And if you're somebody who wants more tools to deal with more of the problems, like going around and completing all of the areas in the overworld is a really cool and emergent way for people to control their own difficulty.
Target's down!
I think one of the most memorable moments of Gears 5's campaign, especially in the overworlds, is the train sequence in the desert, where you start in one area, go through the Skiff, run through the crazy storm, and then end up at a separate facility. Can you walk me through that sequence? It's obviously one of the most intricate parts of the whole overworld campaign. How did that all come together?
Yeah, that actually came together quite late in, we'd always planned to have a train sequence, but I think what had happened was it was going to be, I think, halfway through the Sand Overworld, if I'm not mistaken. It was going to be a little more paced out. It wasn't going to be quite as bombastic as it ended up being. And all those things required like so many different teams to come together and kind of, we always call it the Eye of Sauron. Is that when we get all the disciplines together and deadly focus on one single thing, and all those different people come together with having worked on this open world for so long. I think it allowed us to focus in on what was important. It was kind of a great marriage of classic Gears and the open world. It allowed us to do like the combat that we're known for. It allowed us to mix in the wind flare. It allowed us to mix in the Skiff and traversing the desert. So it did truly feel like the culmination of the new Gears and the old Gears kind of coming together as a nice finale. Because I think we realized that the desert needed a finale and an action scene. I always said to Matt, we need a big action scene to kind of top all this stuff off. So yeah, definitely a multidisciplinary project on that one for sure.
For the Coalition, Gears 4 was a way to introduce yourselves, acclimate yourselves to the series, and Gears 5, like you said earlier, was a way to sort of put your own stamp on things and try a bunch of new ideas. When you reflect back on what you were able to do with Gears 5, adding in the overworlds and still retaining, I guess, what essentially makes Gears, what was that like, or what's it like now to reflect on what you were able to achieve?
When we got the Gears franchise, like, the studio felt a huge responsibility. The Gears community is insanely passionate, right? Like, there's a massive tattoo culture. You got people putting your game on their body. They're passionate about the way it plays. They're passionate about all elements of it. But, as a development team, as a studio, we also knew we were taking on a franchise that meant a lot in the games industry. It had sort of set the bar and foundation for a lot of how cover-based shooters worked over the last decade. It was important to do it right in Gears 4. But we really felt like we could stretch our legs with Gears 5. We felt like we had built the confidence on our team and the expertise technically and design-wise and artistically. Above all, we wanted to make sure it still felt like Gears. We wanted to add all these new ways of playing, these new experiences, and at the end of the day, it needed to feel like Gears. And when you ship a game, you wait with bated breath first for the reviews to come in, and when they started to reflect the things that we'd been talking about in the studio for honestly like 6 years from the time we started Gears 4, that like walk and then run idea, with people talking about how Jack and the overworlds to make one of the best Gears campaigns they'd ever played, And then beyond that, like personally, I lost weeks of my life to watching players stream their campaigns and watching them play. And it's like, it was so gratifying to see players sort of having these aha moments and these discovery moments inside Gears, a game they've been playing forever. And then like a ton of work and a ton of passion goes into making something like Gears 5. It's like all consuming for years of your life. And so when we got to see the passion and the effort that our entire dev team put into the game reflected in the enjoyment and the discovery that people were having about playing something that felt new in a franchise that was over a decade old, that was probably the most gratifying experience.